The candles burned too bright, and Margaret Ashworth felt every eye in the ballroom press against her skin like a physical weight. She had not meant to speak. She had not meant to be noticed at all. Yet the words had already left her mouth, and now the entire room seemed to hold its breath around her. It had happened so fast. Two women beside her, hidden behind painted fans, had been whispering about the Duke of Alaric Thorne, calling him cruel, calling him cold, calling him a man without a heart. Margaret, who had watched him quietly from the edges of every gathering for weeks, felt something rise in her chest that she could not explain. She turned before she could stop herself and said quite clearly that they were wrong about him. The women stared at her as though she had grown a second head. Margaret, a woman of modest birth invited only because her aunt insisted on it, rarely spoke above a whisper in rooms like this. She was not the sort of woman who corrected anyone, least of all strangers gossiping about a duke. But it was too late to take the words back. And worse, the duke himself was standing only a few feet away, half turned toward the conversation, his expression unreadable. He approached her, not with anger, not yet, but with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who noticed everything and forgot nothing. Margaret's heart pounded so hard she feared he could hear it. "You seem to have an opinion of me," he said, his voice low and even. "I did not realize we were acquainted." Margaret's face burned. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I should not have spoken. And yet you did." His gaze held hers, sharp and searching. "Tell me, what do you know of me that gives you such confidence to defend my character to strangers?" She opened her mouth to answer, and that was when it happened. The nickname slipped from her lips before she understood what she was saying. She meant to say, "Your Grace." She meant to say something proper, something safe. Instead, without thought, without warning, she said, "Ricky would never behave so unkindly." The word hung in the air between them like a struck bell. For one terrible moment, nothing moved. The orchestra continued to play somewhere behind them, but to Margaret, the sound seemed to fade into nothing. The Duke's face, always so composed, always so carefully guarded, went utterly still. His eyes, which had been sharp with irritation only a heartbeat before, now held something else entirely. Something raw, something she could not name. "What did you say?" His voice had changed completely. It was no longer smooth and commanding. It was quiet, almost breathless, as though the air had been pulled from his lungs. Margaret blinked, confused by her own words. Forgive me. I do not know why I said that. It simply came to me." "That name," he said, stepping closer, his composure cracking at the edges. "Where did you hear that name?" She shook her head, truly bewildered. "I have never heard it before in my life, Your Grace. I promise you. It simply came out of my mouth. I could not tell you where it came from." He studied her face as though searching for a lie hidden somewhere in her features. Margaret had never been looked at so intensely by anyone, let alone a duke, and she found she could not look away, even though every instinct told her to curtsy and flee. Around them, the ball continued. Couples turned in slow circles across the floor. Laughter rose and fell in distant corners. Servants moved silently with trays of wine, and yet the Duke of Thorne stood frozen in the middle of it all, staring at a woman he had never spoken to before that evening, as though she had reached inside him and touched something buried too deep for anyone to find. "Your Grace," Margaret said softly, when the silence stretched too long to bear, "have I offended you? I did not intend to cause any distress. If I misspoke, I apologize most sincerely." He did not answer at once. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost private, meant only for her. "You could not possibly understand what you have just done." Before she could ask what he meant, a woman's voice called his name from across the room. He straightened at once, the mask sliding back into place so quickly that Margaret almost doubted what she had seen. His shoulders squared, his expression smoothed into practiced indifference. Only his eyes, when they flicked back to her one final time, betrayed that anything unusual had happened at all. "Excuse me," he said stiffly, and turned away without another word, leaving Margaret standing alone amid the swirl of silk and candlelight, her heart hammering, her mind racing to understand what had just occurred. She watched him cross the room toward the woman who had called him, a striking figure in dark green who greeted him with a bright, practiced smile. He answered her pleasantly enough, but Margaret noticed the way his hand tightened briefly at his side, the way his jaw remained tense even as his voice stayed even. Whatever had shaken him moments ago had not fully released its grip. "Margaret," her aunt's voice broke through her thoughts, sharp with concern. "What on earth did you say to the Duke?" Half the room saw him go pale as a ghost. "I do not know," Margaret admitted, still staring after him. "I said something without thinking, and he reacted as though I had struck him." Her aunt's eyes narrowed with worry rather than curiosity. "You must be careful, my dear. Men like the Duke of Thorn do not forgive easily, and they certainly do not forget. If you have embarrassed him in front of society, there could be consequences." Margaret hardly heard her. Her mind kept circling back to the moment his composure had shattered, to the flicker of something achingly vulnerable in his eyes before he buried it again. She had seen glimpses of him from a distance for weeks now, always alone at the edge of gatherings, always polite but never warm, always watching the room as though calculating some private danger only he could see. She had assumed, like everyone else, that he was simply cold by nature. Now she was not so certain. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced conversation and distracted courtesies. Margaret danced twice, out of obligation rather than pleasure, her attention repeatedly drawn across the room to where the Duke stood, stiff and distant, exchanging polite nothings with guests who clearly bored him. Once, just once, she caught him looking at her. It lasted only a second before he turned away, but it was enough to send a strange warmth through her chest, followed immediately by confusion at her own reaction. She did not know this man. She had spoken to him exactly once, and it had ended in disaster. And yet something about the raw honesty she had glimpsed in his eyes lingered with her long after the carriage rolled away from the townhouse and into the dark streets. At home, lying awake long after her aunt had fallen asleep, Margaret turned the strange nickname over in her mind again and again. Ricky, such a plain, small word for a man so guarded, so formidable in public. Where had it come from? She truly could not say. It had simply risen up from somewhere inside her, as though some part of her already understood something her conscious mind did not. She told herself it meant nothing. A slip of the tongue, nothing more. Society would forget the strange moment within a week, distracted by some new scandal or gossip. The Duke would forget her entirely, if he had not already dismissed her as an odd, forward young woman with no sense of propriety. But sleep did not come easily that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face in that frozen instant, stripped of all its careful control, staring at her, as though she held some answer he had been searching for his entire life. Across the city, in a grand and silent house lit by a single candle, the Duke of Thorn sat alone in his study, staring into the darkness beyond the window. His valet had long since retired for the night, and the great house around him had fallen still. He should have been thinking of estate matters, or the letters waiting on his desk, or the tedious obligations of the coming week. Instead, he thought of a stranger's voice, unguarded and sincere, speaking a name no living person had used in nearly 20 years. He rose from his chair and crossed to the small portrait hung above the cold hearth, a woman with kind eyes and a soft, knowing smile, painted many years before her death. He had not allowed himself to look at it in months. "Ricky," he whispered to the empty room, testing the sound of it on his own lips for the first time in a very long while. He did not understand how a stranger, a woman he had never met before tonight, could have spoken his mother's private name for him as though it were the most natural thing in the world. It was impossible. It had to be a coincidence, nothing more. And yet some instinct, old and wary, told him that nothing about tonight had been ordinary at all. He needed to know where she had heard it. He needed to know who she truly was. And beneath that need, quiet and unwelcome, stirred something he had not felt in years, the terrifying, unfamiliar pull of being truly seen. He sat back down at his desk, though he made no move to touch the letters waiting there. His mind kept drifting back to the ballroom, to the exact moment her expression had shifted from polite embarrassment to genuine confusion. She had not looked like a woman playing a clever game. She had looked like someone who truly did not understand the weight of what she had just said. That, more than anything, unsettled him. If she had spoken the name deliberately, cruelly, to provoke him or manipulate him, he would have known how to respond. He had faced schemers before, men and women alike who sought his title, his fortune, or simply the thrill of unsettling a man known for his icy composure. He had learned, over many hard years, how to meet such attempts with silence and distance, but this had been different. Her voice had trembled with sincerity, not calculation, and that frightened him more than any deliberate scheme ever could. He thought of his mother then, as he so rarely allowed himself to do. He remembered her hand smoothing his hair back from his forehead when he was a boy no older than 7, remembered the warmth of her laughter in a house that had once been full of light before illness stole it all away. She was the only person who had ever called him by that small, foolish name, a name meant only for a child who did not yet know what a dukedom would one day demand of him. After she died, he had buried the name along with her, certain that no one else in the world would ever have reason to speak it again. Until tonight, he told himself, again and again, that it meant nothing. A coincidence, a strange trick of chance, nothing more sinister than that. And yet he found himself unable to release the thought, turning it over and over like a coin he could not stop examining. Who was she? He realized, with faint irritation at himself, that he did not even know her name. He had been so consumed by the shock of her words that he had failed to ask the most basic of questions. He resolved, sitting alone in the quiet dark of his study, that he would learn who she was before the week was through. He needed answers, and he would not rest easily until he had them. Outside, the city settled into silence, carriages fading from the streets, candles extinguished one by one in the great houses lining the square. But in two very different houses that night, sleep remained a stranger, to both a duke haunted by a name from his past, and a quiet young woman who could not explain why she had spoken it at all. By morning, half of London seemed to know that something strange had passed between the Duke of Thorn and an obscure young woman at Lady Whitmore's ball. Margaret sat at breakfast, pushing a piece of toast around her plate while her aunt read aloud, with visible relish, every scrap of gossip she had gathered from a note delivered by a neighbor. "They say he went white as milk," her aunt said, eyes wide over the rim of her teacup. "White as milk, Margaret, in front of half the ton. What could you possibly have said to cause such a reaction?" "I have told you already. I do not know," Margaret said, for perhaps the 10th time since the previous night. It was a slip of the tongue. Nothing more. Her aunt did not look convinced, but she let the matter drop, more concerned with speculating about which families might now seek to distance themselves from Margaret should the Duke take offense publicly. Margaret barely listened. Her mind kept returning to his face in that frozen moment, the way something ancient and painful had surfaced behind his eyes, before he wrestled it back under control. She told herself she would likely never speak to him again. A duke did not concern himself with young women of modest fortune, not beyond a single strange encounter he would surely wish to forget as quickly as possible. She was wrong. 2 days later, while walking with her cousin through the public gardens near her aunt's house, Margaret spotted a familiar figure standing beneath the shade of an old elm tree, apparently waiting. Her stomach dropped as she recognized him even from a distance. The Duke of Thorn, dressed simply for once, without the trappings of formal society, watched her approach with an expression she could not quite read. Her cousin, sensing the tension immediately, made a hurried excuse about greeting an acquaintance nearby and slipped away, leaving Margaret alone to face him. "Your Grace?" She dropped into a proper curtsy, her heart pounding. "I did not expect to see you here." "I imagine not." His voice was carefully controlled, though she noticed the same tightness in his jaw she had seen 2 nights before. "I would like a word with you, if you can spare the time." She could hardly refuse a duke, even if every instinct told her to flee in the opposite direction. Of course. He gestured toward a quieter path, away from the small groups of strolling families and chattering couples enjoying the afternoon sun. They walked in silence for a moment before he spoke again, his tone sharper than she expected. "I want the truth this time. Who told you to say that name to me?" Margaret stopped walking, startled by the accusation buried in his question. "No one told me anything, Your Grace. I have already explained that I do not know where the word came from. It simply left my mouth before I understood what I was saying. Forgive me if I find that difficult to believe." His eyes searched hers with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself to hold his gaze. "That name is not something a stranger simply happens to know. Someone must have told you. A servant, perhaps, seeking to curry favor by feeding you information about my past. Or perhaps someone with a grudge against my family, hoping to unsettle me through you." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, though this time it was indignation rather than embarrassment. "I understand that what happened confused you, Your Grace, and perhaps frightened you as well, though I cannot begin to guess why a single word should carry such weight. But I will not stand here and be accused of scheming against you when I have done nothing but speak an unfamiliar word I cannot explain myself." He blinked, clearly not expecting her to push back against him. Most people, she suspected, simply agreed with whatever he said, too intimidated by his title and his reputation to offer resistance. She found, to her own surprise, that she was not so easily cowed. "You misunderstand me," he said after a moment, his tone softening slightly, though the tension in his shoulders remained. "I do not accuse you lightly, but you must understand how impossible your explanation sounds to me. That name belonged to exactly 2 people who ever used it in my presence. One of them has been dead for many years. The other I have not seen since I was a boy of 10. For a stranger to speak it, unprompted, in the middle of a crowded ballroom, defies any reasonable explanation I can construct." Margaret studied his face, seeing past the sharp accusation to the genuine bewilderment beneath it. Whatever had happened, whatever the nickname truly meant to him, it clearly touched a wound far deeper than simple embarrassment. Her irritation softened into something closer to sympathy, though she remained careful not to let it show too plainly. "I wish I could offer you an explanation that satisfied your questions," she said, more gently now, "but I have none. I have never met anyone connected to your family, Your Grace. I have never even been formally introduced to you before that evening. I can only tell you the truth, however unsatisfying it may be." The word simply came to me, as though from nowhere, and I spoke it before I understood what I was saying. He was silent for a long moment, studying her with an expression that had shifted from suspicion to something more uncertain. "That is either the truth," he said slowly, "or you are a remarkably skilled actress. I assure you, Your Grace, acting has never been among my talents. Ask anyone who has witnessed me attempt to sing at a private gathering, and they will confirm as much." A flicker of something crossed his face then, so brief she almost missed it. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, gone before it could fully form. It was the first sign of anything resembling warmth she had seen from him, and it struck her more forcefully than she expected. They walked in silence for a while longer, the tension between them easing slightly, though it did not disappear entirely. Margaret found herself sneaking glances at him as they moved along the path, noting the careful, guarded way he held himself, as though bracing constantly against some invisible threat. She wondered what it must be like to walk through the world always prepared for betrayal, always calculating the hidden motives of everyone around him. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" she said finally, when the silence grew too heavy to bear. He glanced at her, wary. "You may ask. I make no promise to answer. Why does that name mean so much to you? I understand it holds some private significance, but you speak of it as though it were a wound rather than simply a childhood nickname." His expression closed immediately, the brief softness she had glimpsed vanishing behind a wall of careful control. "That is not a question I am prepared to answer, Miss Ashworth." She noted with some surprise that he knew her name, though she could not recall having given it to him. He must have inquired after their first encounter, which meant the strange moment at the ball had troubled him enough to seek out information about her. That realization sent an unexpected thrill through her chest, one she quickly tried to suppress. "Forgive me," she said. "I did not mean to pry into matters that are not my concern." "No," he said, more quietly than before. "It is I who should apologize. I came here prepared to accuse you of conspiring against me, and instead, I find myself with no answers, and considerably more questions than I began with." They had reached the edge of the gardens where the path opened onto the street beyond. He paused, turning to face her fully for the first time since their conversation began. "I do not know what to make of you, Miss Ashworth," he admitted, and something in his voice suggested this confession cost him more than he wished to reveal. "You are either the most convincing deceiver I have ever encountered, or something far stranger than mere coincidence has taken place between us. I find, to my own considerable irritation, that I am inclined to believe the latter." Margaret held his gaze, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. "Then perhaps, Your Grace, we might simply allow the mystery to remain a mystery, rather than searching for schemes and enemies where none exist." He studied her a moment longer, something unreadable moving behind his careful eyes. "Perhaps," he said at last, "though I confess it is not in my nature to leave mysteries unsolved." He bowed, formal and precise despite the informality of their surroundings, and turned to leave without further explanation. Margaret watched him go, her thoughts churning with confusion, and something else she could not quite name, something that felt dangerously close to fascination. Her cousin returned moments later, full of questions Margaret had no intention of answering honestly. She offered only vague reassurances that the Duke had simply wished to apologize for his reaction at the ball, though she suspected her cousin did not entirely believe the explanation. That evening, alone in her room once more, Margaret found herself thinking not of the strange nickname or the mystery surrounding it, but of the brief flicker of warmth she had glimpsed behind his guarded eyes. She had expected a cold, arrogant man, exactly as the gossips described him. Instead, she had found someone carrying a private grief so heavy it had shaped every wall he built around himself. She did not know what would come of their strange, unexpected connection, but she found, much to her own surprise, that she hoped it would not end with a single conversation in a quiet garden. Across town, the Duke returned to his townhouse in a state of unfamiliar agitation. He had gone to the gardens fully intending to extract a confession from her, certain that someone had orchestrated the entire affair to unsettle him. Instead, he had left with nothing but more questions, and a strange, unwelcome awareness of how genuinely she had looked at him, without artifice, without the calculating ambition he had come to expect from every person who sought his attention. He did not understand it, but he found himself, against every careful instinct he had spent years cultivating, wanting to see her again. His butler met him in the entrance hall with a small stack of letters, most of them invitations he had no intention of accepting. He waved them away without much interest and retreated instead to his study, where the fire had already been lit against the evening chill. He sat for a long while without touching anything, replaying the conversation in the gardens again and again in his mind. He had built his entire adult life around the principle of never being caught unprepared. Every conversation he entered, every social gathering he attended, he approached as though it were a negotiation, weighing motives, calculating risk, searching for the hidden angle behind every kind word or friendly gesture. It had served him well. It had kept him from the mistakes his father had made, trusting the wrong people, believing false promises, and paying dearly for that misplaced trust in the end. But Margaret Ashworth had offered him nothing to calculate. No hidden angle, no veiled ambition, no careful positioning for advantage. She had simply looked at him, spoken honestly, and pushed back against his accusations with a directness that startled him more than any clever manipulation could have. He thought of his old nurse, a stern but kind woman who had cared for him in the years after his mother's death, when his father had retreated into grief and left the household to run itself. She had been the only other person who ever used that private name, and only in the quiet hours before bed, when no one else could hear. She had passed away several years ago, taking with her one of the last living threads to that small, vanished boy, who once answered eagerly to a name meant only for those who loved him without condition. How, then, had a stranger spoken it? He turned the question over endlessly, searching for some rational explanation his mind refused to provide. Coincidence seemed the only reasonable answer, however unsatisfying it felt. Perhaps she had heard some other child called by a similar name and simply misspoken in her fluster. Perhaps his own memory, worn thin by years of careful avoidance, had exaggerated the resemblance between the sounds. And yet some quieter part of him, one he rarely allowed to speak, whispered that explanations of coincidence felt too convenient, too easy, to fully satisfy the strange weight the moment had carried. He rose eventually and poured himself a small measure of brandy, standing before the window that overlooked the darkened street below. Carriages passed occasionally, their lamps casting brief golden light across the cobblestones before fading again into shadow. He thought of Margaret walking home through streets much like these, unaware of the storm her innocent words had stirred within him. He resolved, somewhat reluctantly, that he would see her again, not to interrogate her further, though he told himself that remained a reasonable justification should anyone question his motives. He simply found that he wished to understand her better, to determine whether the strange honesty she had shown him in the gardens was genuine or merely a more sophisticated performance than he had first assumed. He did not examine too closely why the prospect of seeing her again brought with it a faint, unfamiliar warmth beneath his chest, one he had not felt in longer than he cared to admit. The following days passed slowly for Margaret, who found herself distracted at every turn by thoughts of their strange encounter in the gardens. She attempted to occupy herself with her usual routines, assisting her aunt with correspondence, practicing needlework she had little enthusiasm for, and accompanying her cousin on modest outings about town. Yet her mind kept drifting back to the Duke's guarded expression, the flicker of vulnerability she had glimpsed before he mastered it once more. She wondered, more than once, whether she had imagined the warmth in that brief unguarded moment, whether her own foolish heart had simply invented significance where none truly existed. A duke, after all, had no reason to think of her beyond the strange coincidence that had thrown them together. She told herself firmly that she should not allow her thoughts to wander toward foolish hopes that could only end in disappointment. Yet when a formal invitation arrived several days later, addressed specifically to her and her aunt, requesting their presence at a modest gathering hosted at the Duke's own estate, Margaret felt her heart leap despite every effort to remain composed. Her aunt, thrilled beyond measure at the unexpected honor, immediately began planning which gown Margaret ought to wear, and speculating wildly about what such an invitation might mean. Margaret, for her part, could only stare at the elegant script bearing his seal, wondering what had prompted him to extend such an invitation, after their tense and uncertain conversation in the gardens. Whatever his reasons, she found she could not deny the quiet thrill of anticipation that settled over her as she considered the prospect of seeing him again. The Duke's estate rose from the countryside like something out of a painting, all pale stone and tall windows catching the afternoon light. Margaret had imagined grandeur, but nothing had quite prepared her for the scale of it. The long avenue of ancient trees leading toward the entrance, the small army of servants moving quietly through the halls with practiced efficiency. The gathering itself was modest by the standards of society. No more than a dozen guests invited for an afternoon of quiet conversation and a light supper. Margaret suspected, from the careful, deliberate way the guest list had been assembled, that the Duke had arranged the entire affair specifically to secure another opportunity to observe her without the pressure of a crowded ballroom. She was not wrong. He found her within the first half hour, drawing her away from the polite chatter of the drawing room under the pretense of showing her a particular painting in the gallery. Once they were alone, his manner shifted, the careful public mask softening just slightly at the edges. "I am glad you accepted the invitation," he said, studying a landscape painting neither of them was truly looking at. "Your aunt seemed rather insistent that we attend," Margaret admitted, though I confess my own curiosity played no small part as well. A faint smile touched his mouth, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "I find myself curious about you as well, Miss Ashworth. It is not a sensation I am accustomed to." They walked slowly through the gallery, the conversation drifting between careful, polite subjects and moments of surprising honesty. Margaret learned, piece by piece, of his fondness for old books, his genuine interest in agricultural improvements on his estates, his quiet, dry humor that emerged only when he forgot to guard himself so carefully. He was nothing like the cold, distant figure society had painted him to be, and with each new discovery, Margaret found herself more drawn to the man hidden beneath the title. He, in turn, seemed equally fascinated by her. She spoke plainly, without the practiced flattery he had grown so accustomed to receiving from society's ambitious daughters. When she disagreed with him, she said so directly, without softening her words to spare his pride. It unsettled him at first, then intrigued him, and eventually, though he would not admit it easily, it began to feel like something close to relief. As the afternoon stretched on, he found himself telling her small things he rarely shared with anyone. He spoke of his father's long decline after his mother's death, of the cold, formal household he had grown up in afterward, stripped of warmth and left only with obligation. He did not speak of the nickname directly, not yet, but Margaret sensed the shadow of it hovering behind his words, the private grief he still had not fully allowed himself to face. "You loved her very much," Margaret said quietly, when he described his mother's gentle laughter, the way she used to read to him beside the fire on winter evenings. "I did," he admitted, his voice rougher than usual. "She was the only person who ever looked at me and saw a boy, rather than an heir. After she died, that boy simply ceased to exist. There was no room for him anymore, not in the life my father demanded of me." Margaret felt a pang of genuine sorrow for him, this guarded, formidable man who had been forced to abandon his own childhood the moment grief entered his home. She understood, suddenly and completely, why the nickname had struck him so violently that night at the ball. It was not simply a private word. It was the last surviving piece of a self he had been forced to bury. "Perhaps," she said gently, "that boy is not as gone as you believe." He looked at her sharply, something vulnerable flickering across his features before he mastered it once more. He did not answer directly, but the way his gaze lingered on her told her the words had struck somewhere true. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the arrival of another guest, a woman named Lady Priscilla Fenwick, who swept into the gallery with the confident air of someone accustomed to commanding attention wherever she went. She greeted the Duke with practiced warmth, her eyes flicking briefly, coolly, toward Margaret before returning to him with renewed focus. "There you are, Your Grace. I have been searching everywhere. You promised me a tour of the gardens before supper, if you recall." "Of course," he said, his public composure sliding back into place with practiced ease. "Forgive me, Miss Ashworth. Duty calls." Margaret curtsied politely as he excused himself, watching as Lady Priscilla claimed his arm with obvious satisfaction. She recognized the woman's manner immediately, the practiced charm, the calculated confidence of someone who considered the Duke's attention rightfully hers to claim. An older gentleman standing nearby, observing the exchange with visible amusement, leaned toward Margaret once the pair had moved out of earshot. "Lady Priscilla has set her sights on His Grace for the better part of 2 seasons now," he confided. "Her family holds considerable influence, and she does not take kindly to competition for his attention." Margaret said nothing, though a small, uncomfortable knot formed in her stomach at the observation. She had no claim on the Duke, no right to feel troubled by another woman's obvious pursuit of him, and yet she could not deny the small, unwelcome twist of jealousy that accompanied the thought of Lady Priscilla walking beside him through the gardens, confident and assured in a way Margaret could never quite manage to feel in his presence. She spent the remainder of the afternoon in polite conversation with the other guests. though her attention repeatedly drifted toward the windows overlooking the gardens, where she occasionally caught glimpses of the Duke and Lady Priscilla walking among the hedgerows. He appeared attentive, courteous, exactly as propriety demanded, though Margaret noticed, or perhaps merely hoped she noticed, a certain stiffness in his posture that suggested his attention was not fully engaged. When the party finally gathered for supper, Margaret found herself seated some distance from the Duke, separated by several other guests, including Lady Priscilla, who had positioned herself deliberately close to him. Margaret ate quietly, participating in polite conversation with those nearest her, while stealing occasional glances down the length of the table. Once, their eyes met across the room, and something passed between them, brief and wordless, before propriety demanded they both look away. It was enough, however fleeting, to remind her that whatever connection had formed between them in the quiet gallery earlier that afternoon had not simply been her imagination. After supper, as the guests began to disperse into smaller groups for cards and quiet conversation, Margaret found a moment to slip away onto a small terrace overlooking the gardens, grateful for a few minutes of solitude away from the watchful eyes of society. The evening air was cool and fragrant with the scent of late summer roses, and she breathed deeply, trying to steady the strange tangle of emotions the day had stirred within her. She was not alone for long. "I hoped I might find a quiet moment to speak with you again before the evening ended," the Duke said, appearing beside her with the same quiet, deliberate steps she remembered from their very first encounter. "I thought Lady Priscilla might occupy your attention for the remainder of the evening," Margaret said, unable to fully mask the edge in her voice. He studied her for a moment, something like understanding dawning in his expression. "Lady Priscilla is a family friend, with ambitions that extend considerably beyond friendship. I have made my lack of interest clear on several occasions, though she remains, shall we say, persistent." Margaret felt a small, foolish flicker of relief at his words, though she tried to school her expression into something more neutral. "It is not my place to comment on your associations, Your Grace." "Perhaps not," he said, "though I find I would rather you did, if your honest opinion differs from polite silence." She glanced up at him, surprised by the openness in his tone. "Then I will say only that she does not strike me as someone who sees you clearly. She sees a title, a fortune, a position in society. I do not think she sees the man who loved his mother's laughter, or who still mourns the boy he was forced to leave behind." He was quiet for a long moment, the only sound between them the distant murmur of conversation drifting from the house behind them, and the soft rustle of wind through the garden hedges. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she had not heard from him before. "You see quite a lot, Miss Ashworth, for someone who has known me only a handful of days. Perhaps I simply pay closer attention than most," she said softly. He turned to face her fully, the careful distance he usually maintained noticeably absent in that moment. "I find myself, against every careful instinct I possess, wanting to trust you. It is not a comfortable sensation. I have spent a great many years ensuring that no one holds that particular power over me." "I do not seek power over you, Your Grace," Margaret said, meeting his gaze steadily. "I seek nothing at all beyond honest conversation, which seems a rare enough commodity in the circles you inhabit." Something shifted in his expression then, the last remnants of guarded distance falling away entirely. For a moment, standing together on the quiet terrace beneath the darkening sky, he looked less like a formidable duke, and more like the lonely boy he had described earlier that day, hungry for a connection unclouded by ambition or calculation. Margaret. Her name, spoken without title or formality for the first time, sent an unexpected warmth spreading through her chest. "I do not know what to make of the strange circumstances that brought us together, but I find increasingly that I do not wish to question it too closely. I simply wish to understand you better, if you will allow it." "I would like that very much," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, standing so close in the cool evening air, something unspoken passed between them, a fragile, tentative understanding neither of them was quite ready to name aloud. He reached out, as though to take her hand, his fingers hovering just short of hers. The sound of approaching footsteps and Lady Priscilla's bright, carrying voice shattered the moment entirely. He stepped back at once, the familiar careful distance reasserting itself as quickly as it had disappeared, though Margaret caught the flicker of frustration that crossed his features before he mastered it. "Your Grace, there you are," Lady Priscilla said, appearing at the terrace doors with two other guests trailing behind her. "We have been asking after you for cards. You simply must join us." "Of course," he said, his voice smooth and composed once more, though Margaret noticed the tightness that had returned to his jaw. He offered her a brief, formal bow before allowing himself to be led back into the house, leaving Margaret alone once more, beneath the darkening sky, her heart still racing from the moment they had shared. She remained on the terrace a while longer, gathering her composure before rejoining the gathering, uncertain what to make of the fragile, unfinished connection that had formed between them, and equally uncertain what obstacles still lay ahead before either of them might find the courage to see it through. When she finally returned to the drawing room, she found the card tables already arranged, small groups of guests laughing and murmuring over their hands. She took a seat beside her aunt, grateful for the distraction of a game she barely followed, her mind still lingering on the terrace and the words that had passed between them. Lady Priscilla, seated across the room beside the Duke, laughed often and loudly at whatever he said, though Margaret noticed his responses remained brief, his attention frequently drifting toward the doorway, as though searching for something, or someone, beyond the immediate demands of the game. Once or twice, his gaze found hers across the room, brief and unreadable, before duty pulled his attention back to his cards. An elderly widow seated near Margaret, a Mrs. Caroline Whitfield, leaned close with the easy familiarity of someone long past caring for propriety's finer restraints. "You have caught his eye, my dear," she murmured, her sharp eyes twinkling with knowing amusement. "I have known that young man since he was in short trousers, and I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you on that terrace." Margaret flushed, uncertain how to respond to such a direct observation. "I am sure you are mistaken, Mrs. Whitfield. The Duke has shown me nothing more than ordinary courtesy." "Ordinary courtesy," the widow repeated, chuckling softly. "My dear girl, I watched that young man endure an entire season of eligible young ladies parading past him, without so much as a flicker of interest. Whatever passed between the two of you on that terrace was decidedly not ordinary." Margaret said nothing further, though the widow's words lingered with her for the remainder of the evening, stirring a cautious, fragile hope she hardly dared to acknowledge even to herself. As the evening drew to a close and guests began calling for their carriages, Margaret found herself once more near the entrance hall, waiting for her aunt to finish a lingering conversation with their hostess. The Duke appeared beside her, having apparently extracted himself from Lady Priscilla's company at last. "I hope the evening was not entirely dominated by cards and idle chatter," he said quietly, keeping his voice low enough that only she could hear. "It was a lovely evening, Your Grace," she said, "though I confess the terrace remains my favorite part of it." Something warm flickered behind his careful expression. "I share that opinion entirely." Her aunt approached before further conversation could continue, full of effusive thanks for the invitation and praise for the beauty of the estate. The Duke received her compliments graciously, his public composure firmly back in place, though Margaret caught one final glance directed toward her before they departed, a silent promise that their conversation was far from finished. The carriage ride home passed largely in silence, her aunt too exhausted from the excitement of the day to maintain her usual stream of commentary. Margaret stared out the window at the passing darkness, replaying every moment of the afternoon and evening in her mind, from the quiet vulnerability he had shown her in the gallery, to the fragile, unfinished moment on the terrace before Lady Priscilla's interruption. She understood, with growing clarity, that whatever had begun between them was no longer a simple mystery to be solved and forgotten. It had become something far more delicate and far more dangerous to her own carefully guarded heart than she had anticipated when she first accepted the invitation to his estate. Back at his own house, the Duke retired to his study once more, though sleep felt further away than ever. He found himself thinking not of the strange coincidence of the nickname, which had consumed his thoughts so completely in the days prior, but of the quiet honesty in Margaret's eyes as she spoke of the boy he had once been, the boy he had believed permanently lost to grief and duty. He thought, too, of Lady Priscilla's persistent attention and the growing awareness that her ambitions, however politely disguised, held nothing of the genuine connection he had felt standing beside Margaret on the terrace. He had spent years assuming that no one would ever look past his title to see the man beneath it. Margaret Ashworth, in the span of only a handful of encounters, had somehow managed to do exactly that. He knew, with the same careful, deliberate certainty he applied to every important decision in his life, that he could not simply allow this fragile connection to fade away unexplored. Whatever obstacles society, ambition, or his own guarded nature might place before them, he found himself unwilling to abandon the possibility of something real, something honest, for the first time since his mother's death had taught him the cost of trusting too freely. He did not yet know what path forward might look like, nor what dangers still lingered in the shadows of his careful, controlled world. But he resolved, sitting alone in the quiet dark of his study, that he would find a way to see Margaret again, and soon. The whispers began quietly at first, the kind of gossip that traveled through drawing rooms disguised as concern rather than malice. By the end of the week, however, they had grown loud enough that Margaret could no longer pretend not to notice the sudden coolness in the greetings she received from acquaintances who had once been perfectly pleasant. It started with a comment overheard at a modest tea gathering hosted by a family friend. Two women, seated just close enough for their words to carry, discussed with theatrical concern how strange it was that an unknown young woman of no particular fortune had managed to secure not only the Duke's private attention, but knowledge of intimate details from his childhood that even close family friends had never been told. "One wonders how she came by such information," one woman murmured, just loud enough to ensure Margaret heard every word. "It does seem rather calculated, does it not? A stranger, speaking a private name known to almost no one, at the exact moment it would guarantee his notice." Margaret said nothing, though her hands trembled slightly as she set down her teacup. She had suspected, from the moment the rumors began circulating, that someone was deliberately shaping the story to cast suspicion on her character. She simply had not yet determined who. She did not have to wait long to find out. Lady Priscilla Fenwick, it seemed, had taken considerable offense at the Duke's obvious preference for Margaret's company, and had spent the days following the gathering at his estate, carefully cultivating a narrative that painted Margaret not as an innocent bystander caught in a strange coincidence, but as a calculating fortune hunter who had somehow learned private details of the Duke's past, specifically to manipulate his emotions and secure his attention. The rumors grew more elaborate with each retelling. Some claimed Margaret had bribed a former servant of the Duke's household for information. Others suggested she had studied his family history extensively before the season began, searching for some private details she might use to distinguish herself from the countless other young women seeking his notice. A few, more cruelly imaginative than the rest, suggested she had invented some fictional connection to his mother's family entirely, hoping to weave a story too sentimental for the grieving Duke to resist. Margaret found herself increasingly isolated as the rumors spread. Invitations that had once arrived regularly began to dwindle. Acquaintances who had greeted her warmly at previous gatherings now offered only stiff, distant courtesy, their eyes carrying the particular judgment reserved for someone suspected of scheming beyond her proper station. Her aunt grew increasingly distressed as the whispers reached her own circle of friends. "This is precisely what I feared," she said one evening, wringing her hands as she paced the small parlor of their townhouse. "A man of his position, and you a woman of modest means with no great fortune to recommend you. Society will never allow such an attachment to proceed without searching for some hidden motive, some scandal to explain it away." "I have done nothing wrong," Margaret said, though the words felt increasingly hollow against the weight of accusation building around her. "I cannot control what people choose to believe, no matter how far it strays from the truth." "No," her aunt agreed sadly, "but you can control whether you continue to give them reason to speculate. Perhaps it would be wisest to withdraw from society for a time, until the gossip loses its interest, and moves on to some fresher scandal." Margaret said nothing, though the suggestion settled heavily in her chest. She had not asked for any of this. She had not sought the Duke's attention, had not orchestrated the strange coincidence that first drew them together. And yet she found herself paying the price for a mystery neither of them fully understood. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that the Duke himself might offer some public defense against the rumors circulating so freely through society. Instead, in the days following their evening together at his estate, he remained conspicuously silent on the matter, his own public appearances growing increasingly rare as he attended to what his household staff described only as urgent estate business. Margaret told herself there were reasonable explanations for his absence. A man in his position could not simply abandon his responsibilities to defend the reputation of a woman's society already suspected of scheming for his attention. Yet each day that passed without word from him deepened the ache of disappointment settling in her chest, and the whispered accusations grew bolder in the absence of any denial from the one person whose voice might have silenced them entirely. The truth, though Margaret could not know it, was considerably more complicated than simple indifference. The Duke had indeed heard the rumors circulating through society, and they had troubled him greatly, though not for the reasons society assumed. He recognized immediately, with the sharp, suspicious instinct honed by years of navigating a world full of hidden agendas, that the story bore all the hallmarks of a deliberate campaign rather than organic gossip. The specific cruel details, the timing of their spread, the particular cruelty aimed at undermining Margaret's character rather than simply questioning the coincidence, all suggested careful orchestration by someone with a personal motive. He suspected Lady Priscilla almost immediately, though he had no immediate proof to confirm his suspicion. He found himself caught in an uncomfortable position, unwilling to publicly defend Margaret without evidence that might only fuel further speculation about the true nature of their connection, yet equally unwilling to abandon her to the growing cruelty of society's judgment. His hesitation, born from years of careful, calculated caution rather than any genuine doubt about Margaret's character, proved to be a costly miscalculation. He spent several days quietly investigating the source of the rumors, questioning household staff and society acquaintances with careful discretion, determined to uncover proof before taking any public action that might expose Margaret to further scrutiny. He told himself this careful approach served her best interests, protecting her from the appearance of scandal by ensuring any defense he offered could not be dismissed as mere sentiment. He did not consider, in his careful calculation, how his continued public silence might appear to Margaret herself, isolated and increasingly desperate beneath the weight of accusations she had no power to disprove on her own. By the time he had gathered enough information to move against the rumors with confidence, nearly a week had passed, an eternity within the fast-moving currents of society gossip, and by then, the damage to Margaret's reputation, and to her fragile trust in him, had already taken deep root. Margaret received word, through a stiffly worded note from her aunt's acquaintance, that she had been quietly removed from the guest list of an upcoming gathering she had previously been invited to attend, the hostess citing vague concerns about propriety that everyone understood to mean something considerably less polite. It was the final blow in a week already heavy with small, cutting rejections, and it broke something in Margaret's careful composure that she had been struggling to maintain. She sat alone in her room that evening, staring at the note until the words blurred together, feeling the full weight of isolation settle over her. She had allowed herself, against every sensible instinct, to hope for something real with the Duke, something that transcended the careful calculations and hidden motives that governed every relationship within society's rigid boundaries. Instead, she found herself abandoned to face the consequences of a connection neither of them had fully understood, while he remained silent, distant, seemingly unwilling to risk his own carefully guarded reputation in her defense. She resolved, sitting alone with the ashes of her hope, that she would withdraw from society entirely, at least until the scandal faded into forgotten history. She would not continue subjecting herself to public humiliation for the sake of a connection that apparently meant considerably less to him than it had come to mean to her. The following morning, she informed her aunt of her decision to decline all further invitations for the remainder of the season, citing exhaustion and a need for quiet reflection. Her aunt, though clearly disappointed, did not argue the point, recognizing perhaps that no amount of persuasion could ease the particular wound Margaret carried. She did not know, as she began quietly withdrawing from the social circles that had briefly promised her something extraordinary, that the Duke had finally uncovered undeniable proof of Lady Priscilla's involvement in orchestrating the entire campaign against her character, nor that he was even now preparing to confront the truth publicly, however late that reckoning had come. For Margaret, isolated and heartbroken in the quiet of her aunt's townhouse, it felt as though whatever fragile possibility had existed between them had already been extinguished beyond any hope of rekindling. The investigation that finally uncovered the truth had begun almost by accident. The Duke's valet, a quiet, observant man named Edmund Carey who had served the household for many years, mentioned in passing that one of the kitchen maids had overheard a conversation between Lady Priscilla and her personal companion during her visit to the estate. At the time, the maid had thought little of it, assuming it merely idle chatter between friends. It was only when the rumors about Margaret began circulating so widely that she recognized the connection and mentioned it to another servant, who eventually brought the matter to Carey's attention. The Duke summoned the maid directly, a nervous young woman named Alice who clearly feared the consequences of speaking against a woman of Lady Priscilla's standing. He assured her, with as much gentleness as his usual composed manner allowed, that her honesty would be protected, and that her position within the household remained entirely secure regardless of what she revealed. Alice's account, once she found the courage to share it fully, confirmed his growing suspicions. She had overheard Lady Priscilla instructing her companion to begin quietly circulating specific details about Margaret among certain society acquaintances known for their love of gossip, details carefully crafted to suggest calculation and scheming rather than innocent coincidence. Lady Priscilla had apparently grown convinced, following the gathering at his estate, that Margaret posed a genuine threat to her own ambitions, and had resolved to eliminate that threat through the most effective weapon available to a woman of her social standing: reputation. Armed with this information, though it remained largely second-hand and difficult to prove beyond doubt, the Duke found himself facing a difficult decision. He could confront Lady Priscilla directly, risking a scandal of his own making should she deny the accusation and turn society's sympathy against him for believing the word of a servant over a woman of her standing. Or he could take a more careful, measured approach, gathering additional evidence before acting, ensuring any eventual confrontation could not be dismissed or deflected. He chose the careful path, as he had chosen throughout his entire adult life, prioritizing certainty over speed, protection over risk. It was a choice born from years of hard-learned caution, from watching his father's impulsive trust lead to devastating consequences for their family's standing and fortune. He told himself this careful deliberation served Margaret's interests as much as his own, ensuring that when he finally moved against the rumors, his defense would carry unshakable authority. He did not fully appreciate, in his careful calculation, the cost of each additional day spent gathering proof, while Margaret suffered the accumulating weight of society's judgment without any public defense to ease her isolation. By the time he had secured a second, more direct confirmation from another member of the household staff who had witnessed Lady Priscilla's companion delivering specific instructions to a notorious society gossip known for her willingness to spread scandal for the right incentive, nearly a full week had passed since the rumors first began circulating. He resolved, with the confirmation finally secured, to act decisively and swiftly, unwilling to allow any further delay. He arranged a private meeting with Lady Priscilla, under the pretense of discussing an unrelated family matter, wanting to confront her directly rather than allow the confrontation to unfold in a public setting where her practiced charm might more easily deflect the accusation. She arrived at his townhouse with her usual confident bearing, clearly unaware of the true purpose behind his summons. Her expression shifted rapidly from polite curiosity to careful alarm as he laid out, calmly and methodically, the evidence he had gathered against her. "I do not know what you imagine you have discovered," she said, her voice tight with barely restrained anger. "But I assure you, Your Grace, I have done nothing beyond expressing reasonable concern about a stranger's sudden, suspicious knowledge of your private affairs. Reasonable concern does not require deliberately instructing your companion to spread deliberately cruel fabrications to known gossips," he replied, his voice carrying the same cold, controlled authority he typically reserved for matters of significant consequence. "I have 2 independent accounts confirming your involvement, Lady Priscilla. I would advise against further denial, unless you wish this conversation to become considerably less private." Her composure cracked slightly under the weight of his certainty, though she maintained her defiant posture. "She does not belong in our circles, Your Grace. Surely you see that. A woman of no fortune, no significant family connection, suddenly claiming intimate knowledge of matters that concern only you. What was I meant to think, watching you fall so easily under her spell?" "You were meant to mind your own affairs," he said sharply, "rather than orchestrating a campaign of cruelty against a woman who has done nothing to deserve it. Whatever suspicions you harbored about the coincidence surrounding our first meeting were not yours to weaponize against her character." Lady Priscilla said nothing further, though her expression made clear she understood the confrontation had not gone in her favor. He informed her, with icy precision, that he expected her to take immediate and decisive action to correct the rumors she had spread, and that any further attempts to undermine Margaret's reputation would result in considerably more severe consequences for her own standing within society. She left shortly afterward, her carefully cultivated composure noticeably shaken, leaving the Duke alone once more with the uncomfortable realization of how much damage his careful, deliberate caution had allowed to accumulate in the time it took him to act. He knew, with growing urgency, that confronting Lady Priscilla represented only the first step. The rumors had already spread far beyond her initial circle of influence, and correcting them would require more than a private confrontation behind closed doors. It would require a public defense, decisive and unmistakable, delivered in a setting where all of society could witness it clearly. More urgently still, he needed to see Margaret herself, to explain the reasons behind his troubling silence, and to determine whether the damage already done to her trust in him could still be repaired before it hardened into something beyond his reach. The Duke arrived at Margaret's aunt's modest townhouse late in the afternoon, having spent the better part of the day gathering his thoughts and composing what he wished to say. He had never before called upon a young woman's home unannounced, and the impropriety of the visit troubled him considerably less than the fear that he had already lost whatever fragile trust had begun growing between them. Margaret's aunt answered the door herself, her eyes widening with surprise at finding a Duke standing on her modest doorstep. She ushered him inside quickly, clearly flustered by the unexpected honor, and hurried to inform Margaret of her visitor while the Duke waited in the small, plainly furnished parlor. Margaret entered a few minutes later, her expression carefully composed, though he did not miss the wariness behind her eyes, nor the faint shadows beneath them that suggested she had slept poorly in recent days. "Your Grace," she said, offering a formal curtsy that carried none of the warmth from their previous encounters. "I did not expect a visit." "I imagine not," he said, feeling the weight of her careful distance more acutely than he had anticipated. "I would not have called without invitation if the matter were not urgent." Her aunt hovered nearby, clearly torn between propriety and curiosity, until the Duke requested, with careful politeness, a few minutes alone with Margaret to discuss a private matter. Her aunt hesitated only briefly before retreating to another room, leaving the door slightly ajar in deference to propriety. "I owe you an explanation," he began, once they were as alone as circumstances allowed, "and an apology, though I fear both come considerably later than they should have." Margaret said nothing, waiting, her expression giving away little of what she truly felt. "I heard the rumors circulating about you almost as soon as they began," he continued, forcing himself to speak plainly despite every instinct urging careful, guarded language. "I suspected immediately that Lady Priscilla was behind them, though I lacked proof to confront her directly. I spent the following days investigating quietly, gathering evidence, rather than speaking publicly in your defense without certainty behind my words." "I see," Margaret said quietly, though her tone carried an edge he had not heard from her before. "And in the time you spent gathering your careful certainty, I was left to face the consequences alone, without so much as a word from you to suggest you believed the accusations false." He absorbed the criticism without flinching, recognizing the fairness of it even as it struck deep. "You are right to be angry with me. I told myself I was protecting you, ensuring my eventual defense could not be dismissed or turned against you further. But I understand now that my silence caused you real harm. Harm I could have prevented had I acted with courage instead of caution." Margaret's composure wavered slightly, the careful distance in her expression giving way to something rawer, more wounded. "Do you have any understanding of what this past week has been like for me? I have watched invitations disappear one by one. I have been quietly excluded from gatherings I once attended freely. Women who greeted me warmly a fortnight ago now look at me as though I were something unclean, something to be avoided. And through all of it, I heard nothing from you, no word of support, no indication that you believed me innocent of the scheming they accused me of." "I know," he said, his voice rough with genuine regret. "I have confronted Lady Priscilla directly. I have evidence of her involvement, confirmed by 2 separate accounts from my household staff. She has agreed to correct the rumors she spread, though I understand that correction alone cannot undo the damage already done to your reputation, or to your trust in me." Margaret turned away, moving toward the window, her arms wrapped around herself as though bracing against a chill only she could feel. "I do not know what you want me to say, Your Grace. I appreciate that you eventually acted, but I cannot pretend the delay did not wound me deeply. I began to believe you thought so little of our connection that you were unwilling to risk your own standing to defend me. That was never true," he said, moving closer, though he stopped short of closing the distance entirely, respecting the careful space she had placed between them. "Margaret, I need you to understand something about me, something I have not spoken of to anyone in a very long time." She turned back to face him, something in his tone catching her attention despite her lingering hurt. He drew a slow breath, gathering the courage for words he had avoided speaking for nearly 2 decades. "The name you spoke that first night, at the ball. Ricky. It was what my mother called me, when I was very young, before illness took her from us. It was a private name, meant only for the boy I was before duty, and grief demanded I become someone else entirely. After she died, my father could not bear to hear it spoken, and I learned quickly to bury that boy completely, to become the composed, controlled figure society now knows as the Duke of Thorn." Margaret's expression softened, the earlier hurt giving way to careful attention as she listened. "When you spoke that name, unprompted, without any possible way of knowing its significance, it frightened me more than I can adequately explain," he continued, his voice growing quieter, more vulnerable than she had ever heard it. "It felt as though something I had buried so deeply, so carefully, had suddenly been exposed in front of the entire ton. I reacted with suspicion, because suspicion has always been easier for me than vulnerability. I have spent my entire adult life ensuring that no one holds the power to hurt me, the way grief hurt me as a boy. Trusting you, truly trusting you, meant risking that same vulnerability again." "That is why you hesitated," Margaret said softly, understanding dawning in her expression. "Not because you doubted my innocence, but because acting in my defense meant exposing how much you had already come to care." "Yes," he admitted, the single word carrying the weight of a confession far larger than its length suggested. I told myself, careful investigation served your interests. In truth, I was afraid of what it meant that a stranger's accidental words had unraveled composure I spent 20 years constructing. Afraid of what it meant that I found myself, against every careful instinct, wanting to trust you completely, wanting to let you see the boy I buried alongside my mother. Margaret felt tears gathering, though she blinked them back, unwilling to let emotion overwhelm the significance of the moment unfolding between them. You could have told me this before now. It would have explained so much of what confused and hurt me these past days. I know, he said, and I am sorry, more sorry than I know how to properly express, for the pain my silence caused you. You deserved better than careful caution when you needed honest support. You deserved a man willing to risk his own comfort to defend yours. She studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any trace of the calculated performance she had once feared, finding instead only raw, unguarded sincerity. Why are you telling me this now? What has changed? Because I realized, sitting alone after confronting Lady Priscilla, that my careful caution had already cost me something I was not prepared to lose, he said, closing the remaining distance between them slowly, deliberately. I do not wish to be the man who protects his own composure at the expense of the people who matter most to him. I want to be someone worthy of the honesty you have shown me from the very beginning, even when I met that honesty with suspicion and doubt. And the name, Margaret asked quietly. Ricky. What does it mean, that you are telling me all of this now? He reached out, this time not hesitating, taking her hand gently in his own. It means that for the first time in nearly 20 years, I find myself wanting someone to know that boy existed, not simply as a curiosity or a mystery to be solved, but as a genuine part of who I am beneath the title, beneath the careful composure. I have not felt safe enough to want that with anyone. Until you. Margaret's fingers tightened around his, the last remnants of her careful distance dissolving beneath the weight of his confession. I do not know why I spoke that name that night. I still cannot explain it, not truly. But I am glad, whatever strange coincidence brought it to my lips, that it led us here, to this honest conversation, however difficult the path to reach it has been. As am I, he said, his voice thick with emotion he no longer attempted to suppress. Though I intend to spend considerably more effort ensuring that any future difficulties between us are met with honesty and courage, rather than careful, wounding caution. They stood together in the quiet parlor for a long moment, the weight of the past week's pain beginning to ease beneath the fragile, hopeful understanding growing between them. Margaret knew the damage to her reputation would not disappear overnight, that society's judgment, once cast, rarely reversed itself without considerable effort, but she found, holding his hand in the quiet afternoon light, that she no longer feared facing that challenge alone. What happens now? She asked softly. Now, he said, something resembling determination settling into his expression. I intend to ensure that all of society understands exactly how mistaken they were to doubt your character. I have allowed caution to cost us both too much already. I do not intend to make that mistake again. Margaret felt a small, hopeful smile tug at her lips for the first time in what felt like a very long week. Then perhaps, Your Grace, we might face whatever comes next together, rather than each of us carrying the burden alone. Together, he agreed, the word carrying a warmth and certainty that settled deep into her chest, chasing away the last remnants of the hurt and isolation she had carried through the difficult days behind them. Her aunt, listening rather shamelessly from just beyond the parlor door, could not entirely suppress a small, satisfied smile of her own at the sound of their quiet, hopeful conversation, already beginning to imagine the possibilities such a reconciliation might bring for her niece's future. Before he departed that afternoon, the Duke lingered a moment longer, clearly reluctant to leave the fragile warmth that had finally settled between them after so many days of uncertainty and doubt. I would like to call again tomorrow, if you will permit it, he said. Properly this time, with your aunt's full knowledge and blessing, rather than the somewhat irregular circumstances of today's visit. I would like that, Margaret said, and meant it more sincerely than she had expected to feel only an hour earlier, when she had answered the door prepared for nothing more than a formal, painful farewell to whatever connection they might have shared. He bowed over her hand before taking his leave, and Margaret watched from the window as his carriage pulled away down the narrow street, feeling something in her chest ease for the first time in what felt like a very long week. Her aunt reappeared almost immediately, no longer bothering to disguise her curiosity. Well, she said, settling into a chair with barely contained excitement. I believe an explanation is owed, my dear. What on earth has happened? Margaret found herself recounting the conversation in careful pieces, though she kept the deepest, most private parts of his confession to herself, sensing instinctively that such vulnerability deserved protection, even from her well-meaning aunt's eager curiosity. She spoke instead of his apology, his confrontation with Lady Priscilla, his promise to publicly correct the damage done to her reputation. Her aunt listened with growing satisfaction, already calculating, in the practical way she approached most matters, how quickly society's opinion might shift once the Duke made his intentions clear. "This changes everything, Margaret. If he is willing to defend you publicly, to be seen actively championing your character, the very people who whispered against you will scramble to forget they ever doubted you at all. Society has a remarkably short memory when a duke's favor is at stake." Margaret found the observation less comforting than her aunt likely intended. She did not want vindication built merely on the shifting tides of society's opinion, dependent entirely on his continued favor and public support. She wanted, she realized, something far more enduring than that. A genuine partnership built on the honest understanding they had finally reached that afternoon, rather than a fragile truce maintained only by his willingness to defend her publicly. She kept this thought to herself, uncertain how to explain such a distinction to her aunt, who had spent her entire life navigating society's rules and expectations with practical, unromantic clarity. That evening, alone in her room, Margaret found herself thinking not of the public vindication her aunt anticipated, but of the quiet vulnerability in the Duke's voice, as he spoke of the boy he had buried alongside his mother's memory. She understood now, with a clarity that had eluded her throughout the confusing, painful days prior, precisely why the accidental nickname had struck him with such force. It was not merely a strange coincidence to be puzzled over and explained away. It had been a key, however unintentional, unlocking a door he had kept firmly closed for nearly 2 decades. She wondered, turning the thought over carefully, whether some part of her had somehow sensed his loneliness from their very first distant observations of him across crowded ballrooms, whether her subconscious mind had reached toward some truth about him that her conscious understanding could not yet articulate. It felt, in the quiet privacy of her own thoughts, less like coincidence and more like recognition, as though some part of her had understood, long before either of them spoke a single word to the other, that beneath his cold, guarded exterior lived someone capable of exactly the kind of honest connection she had always hoped to find. She did not share such fanciful thoughts with her aunt, who would likely dismiss them as overly romantic nonsense unsuited to the practical realities of securing a favorable match. But she held the thought close nonetheless, a private comfort against the lingering uncertainty of what still lay ahead. The following morning brought a formal note from the Duke, confirming his intention to call that afternoon, along with a second, considerably more surprising piece of correspondence, an invitation to a significant society gathering hosted by one of the most influential hostesses in London, an event Margaret had assumed, given the recent scandal surrounding her name, she would never again be welcome to attend. Her aunt's eyes widened considerably upon reading the invitation. "This is no accident, Margaret. He must have spoken to Lady Ashcombe directly, vouching for you personally. An invitation from her carries considerable weight in society. If she has extended her favor to you, others will follow swiftly behind." Margaret felt a mixture of gratitude and apprehension at the prospect. She understood the significance of such a public gesture, understood that attending such a gathering, on the Duke's arm or at least under his visible favor, would begin the slow process of repairing the damage done to her reputation. But she also felt a flicker of nervousness at the prospect of facing society again so soon, particularly the same circles that had so recently whispered accusations against her character. When the Duke called that afternoon, exactly as promised, he found her considerably more composed than the wounded, wary woman who had greeted him the previous day. They spoke at length, this time without the shadow of unresolved hurt hanging between them, discussing plans for the upcoming gathering and the careful, deliberate steps he intended to take to ensure society understood, beyond any reasonable doubt, the falseness of the rumors that had circulated against her. "I do not wish for this to feel like merely a performance for society's benefit," Margaret admitted, as they walked slowly through the small garden behind her aunt's townhouse. "I want whatever exists between us to be genuine, not simply a public display calculated to repair my reputation." "It is genuine," he assured her, his tone carrying the same quiet sincerity she had heard the previous day. "The public gesture serves a practical purpose, certainly, but it stems from something far more personal than mere strategy. I want the world to see clearly what I have come to understand privately, that you are a woman of genuine character, worthy of far better treatment than society's careless gossip afforded you." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. the last remaining shadows of doubt finally beginning to dissolve beneath the steady, growing certainty of his affection. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, whatever careful steps remained before society's judgment fully reversed itself, she found she no longer faced them with dread, but with cautious, hopeful anticipation of what their future together might hold. Lady Ashcombe's ballroom glittered with more candles than Margaret had ever seen gathered in a single room, the light catching against crystal and silk until the entire space seemed to shimmer. She stood near the entrance, her hand resting lightly on the Duke's arm, painfully aware of the eyes already turning toward them as their arrival was announced. "You look pale," he murmured, leaning slightly toward her. "Are you certain you wish to proceed?" "I am certain," Margaret said, though her heart hammered fiercely against her ribs. "I did nothing wrong. I will not hide from a room simply because gossip once turned its cruel attention toward me. I am certain." He smiled at that, something warm and proud flickering behind his careful public composure. "That is precisely the answer I hoped to hear." They moved through the crowd together, and Margaret felt the shift almost immediately. The way conversations paused as they passed, the way eyes followed them with open curiosity, rather than the cold, judgmental distance she had grown accustomed to over the past difficult week. The Duke's presence beside her, attentive and unmistakably warm, spoke more loudly than any words could have managed, and she watched, with quiet satisfaction, as the careful mask of polite disdain slipped from several faces that had previously turned away from her. Lady Priscilla was present as well, standing near the refreshment table with a tight, brittle smile fixed firmly in place. She had, as promised, begun quietly correcting the rumors she had spread, though her efforts carried none of the enthusiasm with which she had originally spread them. When her eyes met Margaret's across the room, she offered only a stiff, reluctant nod before turning quickly away. The evening progressed with a series of small, telling moments that gradually rebuilt what the previous week's rumors had so thoroughly damaged. Women who had once whispered behind their fans now approached Margaret with careful, testing warmth, eager to align themselves with whichever direction society's opinion appeared to be shifting. Margaret accepted their overtures with polite grace, though she found herself unable to entirely forget the coldness they had shown her only days before. It was during a quiet lull in the dancing, as guests gathered near the refreshment tables and the orchestra paused between sets, that the Duke made his move. He requested, with quiet but unmistakable authority, a brief moment to address the gathered guests, a request that carried enough weight from a man of his standing that the room quickly settled into attentive silence. Margaret felt her pulse quicken as he began to speak, uncertain what he intended to say, though she trusted, from the steady warmth in his expression, that whatever came next would not cause her further harm. "I find myself in the unusual position of needing to correct a misunderstanding that has caused considerable and undeserved harm to a woman of genuine character," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed room. "Some among you have heard rumors suggesting that Miss Margaret Ashworth deliberately sought private knowledge of my family's history in order to manipulate my attention. I wish to state, plainly and without ambiguity, that these rumors are entirely false, and that I bear considerable regret for not correcting them sooner." A murmur rippled through the assembled guests, curiosity and surprise mingling in equal measure. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, though this time it carried none of the humiliation of that first night at the ball. She stood beside him, her chin lifted, refusing to shrink beneath the weight of so many curious stares. "The truth," he continued, "is considerably stranger and considerably more personal than the cruel fabrication that has circulated these past days. Miss Ashworth spoke a name that evening she had no possible way of knowing, a private name known only to my late mother and myself. I reacted with suspicion, assuming some deliberate manipulation, because suspicion has always come more easily to me than trust. I was wrong to doubt her character, and I was wrong to allow my own careful caution to leave her exposed to cruel gossip, while I sought certainty rather than acting with the courage her honesty deserved." The room remained utterly silent, every guest hanging on his words with rapt attention. Margaret glanced sideways at him, astonished by the vulnerability he displayed so openly, so publicly, in a setting where he had always guarded himself so carefully. "I have known Miss Ashworth only a short time," he continued, his gaze finding hers now, warm and unwavering. "But in that time, she has shown me more genuine honesty than I have encountered in years spent navigating society's careful calculations and hidden ambitions. I owe her a public apology for my hesitation, and I owe all of you a correction to the falsehoods that have unjustly damaged her reputation. Miss Ashworth is a woman of exceptional character, and any among you who continue to doubt that truth may direct your concerns to me directly." He paused, and Margaret watched, breathless, as something shifted in his expression. the last careful walls of formal composure falling away entirely as he turned to face her more fully, seemingly forgetting, for one suspended moment, the dozens of watching eyes surrounding them. "There is one more matter I wish to address," he said, his voice softening, growing more private despite the public setting. "The name Miss Ashworth spoke that first evening was Ricky. It was what my mother called me, before her death, when I was still young enough to believe the world held nothing but warmth and safety. I buried that name, and the boy who answered to it, for nearly 20 years, certain that no one would ever have reason to speak it again." A hush fell more deeply over the room, guests exchanging quiet, startled glances as they absorbed the unexpected intimacy of his revelation. "I find, however," he continued, his gaze never leaving Margaret's face, "that I no longer wish to keep that boy buried. Margaret has shown me, through her honesty and her courage, that vulnerability need not always lead to pain. That trust, however frightening, can also lead to something far more valuable than the careful, guarded distance I have maintained for most of my adult life." He reached for her hand, holding it gently, unmistakably, in front of the entire assembled gathering. "Ricky," he said softly, offering the small, private word to her like a gift, "is a name I have not allowed anyone to use since my mother's death. I would very much like you to be the one exception to that rule, Margaret, if you are willing to accept it." Margaret felt tears gather, unbidden in her eyes, though she made no effort to blink them away this time. The room around them seemed to fade into soft, unimportant background noise as she focused entirely on the man before her, finally allowing himself, in front of all of society, to be truly and completely seen. "I would be honored," she said, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of the moment. "Ricky." The name settled between them like something sacred, no longer a source of confusion or suspicion, but a symbol of the fragile, hard-won trust they had built together, despite every obstacle placed in their path. A soft murmur of surprise and approval rippled through the watching guests, several women dabbing discreetly at their eyes at the unexpected romance unfolding before them. Lady Ashcombe, their hostess, stepped forward with a delighted smile, clearly recognizing the significance of the moment unfolding within her own ballroom. "Well," she declared, loudly enough for the entire room to hear, "I believe this calls for champagne, rather than idle gossip. Orchestra, if you would be so kind as to resume the music." The room erupted into a flurry of excited conversation and movement, guests eager to congratulate the Duke and offer belated effusive apologies to Margaret for the cruel rumors they had so recently entertained. Margaret accepted their sudden warmth with gracious composure, though her attention remained fixed primarily on the man beside her, whose expression carried none of the guarded distance she had first encountered at that fateful ball only weeks before. "I did not expect quite such a public declaration," she murmured to him, once the immediate flurry of congratulations had eased slightly. "Neither did I," he admitted, a genuine smile spreading across his features, the first she had seen from him without any trace of careful restraint. "But I find that once I began speaking honestly, I found it considerably difficult to stop." They danced together shortly afterward, the first dance either of them had shared since the strange, fateful evening that first brought them together. Margaret felt none of the nervous uncertainty that had plagued her throughout the previous difficult weeks, only a quiet, settled happiness as they moved together across the floor, watched now not with suspicion or cruel curiosity, but with the warm, approving attention reserved for a couple whose genuine affection had finally triumphed over careless gossip and misunderstanding. "I owe you a proper courtship," he murmured, as they turned slowly through the steps of the dance, one built on honesty from its very beginning, rather than confusion and suspicion. "I would like that very much," Margaret said, smiling up at him without any trace of the guarded caution she had once maintained so carefully in his presence. Later that evening, as the gathering began winding toward its natural conclusion, he walked her out to the entrance where her aunt's carriage waited, the cool night air a welcome relief after the heated excitement of the ballroom. "Thank you," Margaret said softly, as they paused beneath the entrance portico, "for finally trusting me enough to be honest, both with me and with all of society tonight." "Thank you," he replied, "for showing me that trust need not always lead to the pain I spent so many years avoiding. I do not know what strange chance or fate brought that accidental nickname to your lips that first evening, but I find myself increasingly grateful for whatever force guided you toward speaking it." He raised her hand to his lips, a formal, courtly gesture that nonetheless carried unmistakable warmth and promise. "Until tomorrow, Margaret." "Until tomorrow," she echoed, watching as he waited, ever the careful gentleman, until she had safely settled into her aunt's carriage before finally allowing himself to step back. As the carriage pulled away into the quiet London night, Margaret settled back against the cushions, her heart full of a happiness she had not dared to hope for only days earlier, when isolation and cruel gossip had seemed poised to end whatever fragile connection had begun growing between them. She understood now, with complete clarity, that the strange, accidental nickname that first drew his attention had led them, through confusion and hurt and careful, hard-won honesty, toward something considerably more enduring than either of them could have anticipated on that fateful evening at Lady Whitmore's ball. Whatever challenges still awaited them, whatever careful steps remained before their courtship reached its natural, hopeful conclusion, Margaret found herself facing the future with a quiet, steady confidence she had never before allowed herself to feel. News of the Duke's public declaration spread through society with remarkable speed over the following days, though this time the whispers carried an entirely different character than the cruel gossip of the previous week. Where once acquaintances had greeted Margaret with cold suspicion, they now approached with eager warmth, many offering elaborate, if somewhat insincere, apologies for ever having doubted her character. Margaret accepted their overtures graciously, though she found herself less concerned with society's shifting opinion than with the steady, growing warmth of the courtship now unfolding openly between herself and the Duke. He called on her regularly in the weeks that followed, always with proper attention to propriety, though the formal courtesies that governed their visits could not entirely disguise the genuine affection growing between them. They walked together in public gardens, attended concerts and modest gatherings, and gradually, through countless small conversations, Margaret came to understand the fuller shape of the man beneath the ducal title, the quiet humor he rarely showed in public, the genuine care he took with his tenants and estate workers, the surprising tenderness he displayed toward his household staff, particularly the old servants who had known him since childhood. Her aunt, thrilled beyond measure at the transformation in Margaret's social standing, could hardly contain her excitement at the prospect of where such a courtship might eventually lead. She began, with barely restrained enthusiasm, discussing wedding possibilities and appropriate trousseau considerations, though Margaret gently reminded her, more than once, that no formal proposal had yet been made. That changed on a quiet afternoon several weeks later, when the Duke called unexpectedly, requesting a private walk through the small garden behind her aunt's townhouse. Margaret sensed immediately that something significant hung in the air between them, though she could not have anticipated quite how swiftly matters would unfold. "I have spent considerable time these past weeks," he began, once they had settled onto a small stone bench beneath a flowering tree, "reflecting on how thoroughly you have changed my understanding of what genuine connection might look like. I entered this season expecting nothing beyond the tedious social obligations my position demands. Instead, I found you, and with you, a version of myself I had believed lost forever." Margaret felt her heart quicken, sensing the direction of his words before he spoke them fully. "I do not wish to waste further time on careful, guarded courtship when I already know, with complete certainty, what I want," he continued, reaching into his coat pocket to withdraw a small, elegant box. "Margaret Ashworth, you have shown me more honesty, more genuine care, than I believed myself capable of receiving. Would you do me the profound honor of becoming my wife?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears, though this time they carried nothing but overwhelming happiness. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, I would be honored, Ricky." He smiled at the private name, the same warm, unguarded expression she had come to treasure over their weeks together, before slipping a delicate ring onto her finger, an heirloom that had belonged, he explained softly, to his mother. "She would have loved you," he said quietly, studying the ring now resting on Margaret's hand. "I believe somehow she already does." Their engagement was announced formally within the week, met with considerable excitement throughout society, all trace of the earlier cruel rumors now entirely forgotten beneath the romantic story of a duke who had finally found genuine happiness after years of careful, guarded distance. Lady Ashcombe, delighted to have hosted the very evening of his public declaration, insisted on organizing an elaborate engagement celebration, an offer Margaret accepted with grateful, if slightly overwhelmed, enthusiasm. Even Lady Priscilla, though clearly still nursing wounded pride, offered a stiff but sincere congratulation when their paths crossed at a subsequent gathering, apparently recognizing that continued hostility served no purpose beyond damaging her own remaining standing within society. As the wedding preparations began in earnest, Margaret found herself reflecting often on the strange, improbable chain of events that had led her to this unexpected happiness. She still could not fully explain why that particular nickname had risen unbidden to her lips on that first fateful evening, though she had long since stopped searching for a rational explanation. Some mysteries, she had come to believe, were simply meant to remain unsolved, their purpose fulfilled not through explanation, but through the connection they ultimately created. The wedding itself, held on a bright spring morning several months later, drew nearly all of society eager to witness the culmination of a romance that had begun under such strange and dramatic circumstances. Margaret walked down the aisle toward a man who no longer needed to guard himself so carefully against the world, whose careful composure had softened, over their months together, into genuine warmth and openness that continued to surprise those who had known him only as the cold, distant Duke of previous seasons. As they exchanged their vows before the assembled guests, Margaret felt the full weight of how far they had traveled together since that first, terrifying moment, when an accidental word had frozen an entire ballroom into stunned silence. What had begun as confusion and suspicion had grown, through honesty and hard-won trust, into something neither of them had believed themselves capable of finding: a genuine, enduring partnership built on complete understanding rather than careful calculation. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the officiant declared, and the Duke, no longer able to contain his happiness behind careful composure, drew Margaret close for a kiss that drew delighted applause from the assembled guests. As they walked back down the aisle together, now bound as husband and wife, Margaret caught his eye and smiled, the private name rising naturally to her lips once more, no longer a source of confusion or suspicion, but simply an expression of the deep, genuine love that had grown between them. "Ricky," she murmured, just for him to hear. "Margaret," he replied, his eyes bright with unmistakable joy. "My wife." Together, they stepped out into the bright spring sunshine, ready to begin the next chapter of a story that had started with a single, accidental word, and had grown into something far more lasting and profound than either of them could have imagined on that fateful evening, when the entire conversation, and the entire course of their lives, had suddenly and irrevocably stopped. 2 years had passed since the wedding, and the great house that once felt so cold and formal to Margaret now rang with a warmth she had never imagined possible when she first walked through its tall stone entrance as a nervous, uncertain guest. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of the morning room, catching the dust motes drifting lazily above a small wooden cradle set near the hearth, where a baby girl slept peacefully, one tiny fist curled against her cheek. Margaret sat nearby, a book resting unopened in her lap, watching her daughter sleep with the quiet, contented happiness that had become such a natural part of her days. She heard familiar footsteps approaching before she saw him, the particular rhythm of his stride that she had come to recognize instantly, even after 2 years of marriage. "There you are," he said softly, entering the room and crossing immediately to peer into the cradle, his expression softening the way it always did in his daughter's presence. "I looked for you in the library first. I finished my book there and decided the sunlight suited me better here," Margaret said, smiling, as he settled beside her, one arm draping comfortably around her shoulders. "She has been asleep nearly an hour now. I confess I have done little beyond simply watching her breathe." "A perfectly reasonable way to spend a morning," he said, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "Though I confess I find myself equally content simply watching you watch her." Margaret laughed softly, leaning into his embrace, marveling still, even after 2 years, at how thoroughly this warm, tender man had emerged from the guarded, formidable Duke she first encountered at that fateful ball. He had changed so much since their courtship began, though she suspected it was less a transformation than a gradual unveiling, the slow, patient revelation of the man he had always been beneath years of careful, protective distance. "Edmund tells me the harvest reports from the northern estate arrived this morning," she said, glancing toward the small stack of correspondence he had carried in with him. "You need not attend to business so early, you know. It can wait until after breakfast, at least. I find I am rather easily distracted from business these days," he admitted, setting the letters aside without further glance. "There are considerably more interesting matters demanding my attention within these walls." Their daughter stirred slightly in her cradle, a small, soft sound escaping her before she settled again into peaceful sleep. They had named her Charlotte, after Margaret's own mother, though the Duke had insisted, with quiet tenderness, that her middle name honor his own mother's memory as well. Eleanor Charlotte Thorne, born on a cold winter morning nearly a year earlier, had brought a warmth into the great house that Margaret suspected it had not known in decades. "Do you remember," Margaret said quietly, watching her daughter sleep, "how frightened you were that first night, when I spoke that name without understanding why?" He smiled, the memory clearly still vivid despite the years that had passed. "I remember it vividly. I do not believe I have ever been more thoroughly unsettled in my entire life, before or since." "I still cannot explain it," Margaret admitted. I have thought about it often over these past years, and I have never found any reasonable explanation for why that particular word rose to my lips at that particular moment. Perhaps some things are not meant to be explained, he said, echoing a sentiment she had voiced herself, long ago, in the quiet aftermath of their reconciliation. I have come to believe it matters less how that moment occurred than what it ultimately brought us toward. Margaret rested her head against his shoulder, watching the gentle rise and fall of their daughter's small chest, feeling the same quiet gratitude that had settled over her so often since their wedding day. She thought sometimes of the isolated, wounded woman she had been during those difficult weeks of gossip and suspicion, and marveled at how far removed that painful memory now felt from the settled, contented happiness of her present life. Later that afternoon, as Charlotte woke and demanded attention with the insistent, cheerful babbling of a healthy, happy child, Margaret carried her out to the gardens, where late summer roses still bloomed in fragrant abundance along the stone pathways. The Duke joined them shortly afterward, having finally attended to his correspondence, and they walked together slowly through the grounds, Charlotte perched happily on her father's shoulders, delighted squeals of laughter carrying across the quiet gardens. "She has your eyes," Margaret observed, watching her husband laugh at some small game he had invented to entertain their daughter. "And your stubbornness, I suspect," he replied, glancing back at Margaret with obvious affection. "She refused her afternoon nap yesterday with the same quiet determination you showed me in that garden, all those years ago, when you refused to simply agree with my accusations." Margaret laughed, remembering their tense early conversation, so different from the easy warmth that now defined their marriage. "I seem to recall you found that stubbornness rather irritating at the time." "Irritating, perhaps, though I confess it was also the very quality that convinced me you were not simply telling me what I wished to hear," he said. "I have always been grateful for it, even in those early days when it frustrated me considerably." They settled onto a small bench overlooking the garden's central fountain, Charlotte content now to sit between them, occupied with a small wooden toy her father had commissioned specifically for her from a local craftsman. Margaret watched her husband interact with their daughter, marveling at the easy, natural tenderness he showed her, so different from the cold, distant reputation that had once preceded him throughout society. "Your mother would be proud of the father you have become," Margaret said softly, watching Charlotte giggle at some silly face he made. His expression softened further at the observation. "I like to believe so. I think often of how different my own childhood might have been, had she lived longer. I am grateful, more than I can properly express, that Charlotte will never know the cold, formal household I grew up in after her death." "She has brought warmth back into this house," Margaret said. "Into you as well, I think, though I suspect that warmth was always there, simply waiting for the right circumstances to draw it forward again." He reached for Margaret's hand, threading his fingers through hers with the easy familiarity of 2 years spent building a life together. "You drew it forward, long before Charlotte arrived to complete our happiness. I do not know what strange chance brought that accidental nickname to your lips that first evening, but I have long since stopped questioning it. I simply remain endlessly grateful for wherever it originated." Charlotte, growing restless with sitting still, reached up with small, insistent hands toward her mother, demanding attention with the wordless authority only a beloved child could command. Margaret lifted her gently, settling her comfortably against her hip, watching as her daughter's attention immediately shifted toward a butterfly drifting lazily among the nearby roses. "Ricky," Margaret said softly, using the private name that had become, over their years together, an easy, natural expression of affection, rather than the fraught, mysterious word it had once been. "Thank you for trusting me with all of this, with yourself, with your grief, with the boy you believed lost forever." He turned to face her fully, his expression carrying the same quiet vulnerability she had first glimpsed on that fateful evening, though it no longer frightened him the way it once had. "Thank you for seeing him clearly enough to call him forward again." They remained together in the quiet garden as the afternoon light softened toward evening, Charlotte's delighted laughter mingling with the gentle sound of the fountain, the great house behind them no longer cold and formal, but warm with the genuine happiness of a family built on honesty rather than careful, guarded distance. Whatever strange coincidence had first brought that private nickname to Margaret's lips, she found herself, 2 years later, endlessly grateful for the extraordinary, unexpected love it had ultimately revealed, a love that had transformed not only their own lives, but the very heart of the house they now called home. As evening approached, old Mrs. Whitfield, the sharp-eyed widow who had first predicted their romance during that fateful gathering at the estate, arrived for a planned supper visit, her carriage rolling up the long drive just as the family made their way back toward the house. She had become a regular presence in their lives over the years, delighting in what she often called her small but undeniable role in their courtship, and never tiring of reminding anyone who would listen that she had recognized the truth of their connection long before either of them fully understood it themselves. "There is my favorite godchild," she declared, sweeping toward Charlotte with open arms the moment she descended from her carriage. Charlotte squealed with delight, reaching eagerly for the elderly woman who had spoiled her with small gifts and endless affection since the day of her christening. "You will ruin her with sweets before supper, as always," Margaret said, though her tone carried nothing but fond amusement. "That is precisely what godmothers are for," Mrs. Whitfield replied, producing a small paper package of sugared almonds from her reticule with practiced efficiency. "Duty demands it." The Duke greeted her warmly, offering his arm as they made their way toward the house, Charlotte still babbling happily in Mrs. Whitfield's embrace. Margaret walked beside them, listening with quiet amusement as the widow recounted, for what must have been the 100th time, her version of the evening she first noticed the unmistakable warmth in his gaze as he watched Margaret across a crowded card table. "I told you then, and I maintain it now," Mrs. Whitfield said, settling into her usual chair once they reached the drawing room, "that I have never in all my years witnessed a man so thoroughly undone by a single evening's acquaintance. It was really quite remarkable to observe." "I believe you have told this story at every visit for the past 2 years," the Duke observed, though his tone carried genuine fondness rather than any real complaint. "And I shall continue telling it for as many years as you continue inviting me to supper," Mrs. Whitfield replied, unbothered. "Some stories deserve constant retelling, particularly when they end so happily." Supper passed in comfortable, familiar conversation, Charlotte eventually growing drowsy enough to be carried off to bed by her nurse, leaving the adults to linger over a final course of fruit and sweet wine. Margaret found herself, as she often did during such quiet evenings, marveling at the completeness of the life they had built together, so different from the uncertain, painful weeks that had once threatened to end their connection before it truly began. Later, after Mrs. Whitfield's carriage had departed and the great house settled into its familiar evening quiet, Margaret and her husband climbed the stairs together to check on their sleeping daughter one final time before retiring themselves. Charlotte lay peacefully in her small bed, one hand curled beneath her cheek in the same posture Margaret had watched that very morning, utterly at peace within the walls of a house that had once known only cold formality and grief. "I used to believe this house would never truly feel like a home again," the Duke said quietly, watching his daughter sleep. "After my mother died, it always felt like a place I merely occupied, rather than somewhere I truly belonged."
"And now?"
Margaret asked softly. "Now," he said, drawing her close against his side, "it feels exactly as it should. Full of warmth, full of laughter, full of the kind of honest love I once believed myself incapable of finding." He pressed a gentle kiss to her hair. "Full of you, and of her, and of everything I never dared hope for during those long, guarded years before you spoke a single accidental word that changed absolutely everything." Margaret smiled, leaning into his embrace as they stood together in the soft evening light of their daughter's nursery, grateful beyond measure for the strange, unexplainable chance that had first brought them together, and for the honest, patient love that had grown, steadily and surely, from that improbable beginning into the enduring happiness that now filled every corner of their shared life.